Greetings and bienvenue, Midnight Crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast. And welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
When I was still in elementary school, my family and I used to spend all summer at my great-uncle's house. We slept in the same room, except for my sister who'd sleep on a bed in the living room, and my great-uncle who'd sleep in his own room. That one was a pretty normal day. We went to the beach, we ate some pizza, and then, at around 10 p.m. we all went to sleep. At around 4 a.m. I suddenly woke up because someone was throwing things around in the kitchen, plastic cups, containers, food, etc. The door was open so I was able to see the light coming from the kitchen, so when I had enough of all that noise I got up from the bed. At first something seemed off. I thought I was having some sort of strange dream. But I realized that it was not a dream. My father wasn't in his bed, but I didn't care much since maybe he was just in the bathroom. My great-uncle was fairly old and had trouble sleeping at night, so I thought he just went into the kitchen to get some water. Uncle, are you all right? All this noise woke me up, I said while making my way to the kitchen. To my surprise, the room was empty. But the light was on and the fridge was open, with a can of Coke laying in front of it. What? I thought. I looked up to the shelf that was to my right, and I saw what was making that noise. Some sort of short creature, around 30 centimeters tall. A gnome, you'd say, was looking at me, terrified. He was terrified because I saw him. I thought to myself, he's going to hurt me, better if I fake to faint. And so I did. After a couple of seconds I opened my eyes, and I saw that I wasn't on the kitchen floor anymore. I was in a strange, colorful tunnel. I got scared again and closed my eyes one more time. After a minute that felt like eternity, I reopened them, and I was laying in my bed. There were still sounds coming from the kitchen, but I was scared and just waited for them to stop. And before sunrise, they did. That wasn't the only encounter I had with that dude. But I never saw it again. I'd only hear him, because I was, and I'm too scared to see him again. I don't know what he was doing exactly, but I'm sure I wasn't supposed to see him. I know it sounds crazy, but there it is.
My family had a house with a long driveway that had a steep hill to the road. One day, my dad drove my sister and I down to the bottom of the driveway to wait for the bus, but it was running late. I really had to go to the bathroom, so I figured I would have time to run back up to the house rather than wait to get to school. I made my way up, and once I got to the top of the hill, I saw that the garage door was open, which was strange because I was almost sure we had shut it. As I got closer, I saw something standing right in the front middle of the garage. I finally made my way up to where I could see, and standing there, I saw a gnome. It looked just like a garden gnome, with the tall, pointy hat, the beard, the boots, the belt. The only things that were different from a garden gnome were that the hat was blue, and the gnome was a bit taller, maybe about the size of a small child. Not knowing what to do and not wanting to get any closer, I just stared at the gnome. After a few seconds, he smiled at me and waved. I did not believe that the gnome had any malevolent intentions, but I felt uncomfortable, like he was not truly friendly. I walked back down the driveway where my dad and sister were waiting. It was the size of a small child. 3 to 5, maybe a little shorter, tall blue hat, buckle belt, brown boots, white beard. There were a few other times during the time that we lived in that house that I suspected the presence of fairies and other supernatural beings. Some of the things that led me to believe this happened before this particular experience. So while there was only a reputation to me and my siblings, it was still a reputation and was before this experience. I have read many books on fairies, along with other supernatural creatures, and I think that it's fair for me to say that I know how to determine one from the next. That includes one type of fairy from another. From stories, research, reading, and such, I know that gnomes are a type of fairy. I have also had other experiences with other things, such as ghosts and aliens, and there are distinct differences between them. As I live, I feel this certain type of feeling, like a vibe or an aura, with almost everything I do, and that's how my memories are kept as well. There is a different type of feel to a fairy encounter versus an alien encounter versus a ghost encounter. Fairies are creatures that live among us, but are elusive. Many people do not believe in fairies on the premise that they are unrealistic, but I believe that they, along with their magic, etc., are real, just simply too uncommonly seen for most people to believe in them.
My mother and grandmother swear this story is true. I found it a bit strange but interesting. It's the summer of 1969, and my mom is 19 years old. Before I go any further, I know what you might be thinking. My mother doesn't do any drugs. Trust me. So, anyway, the summer of '69 and my mom is sleeping in her room, which is off the kitchen. She stayed at my grandmother's sometimes while my father served over in Vietnam. She had the window open that night and heard something outside. She sat up and continued to listen. She was about to get up and look when she saw a little man crawl through. It didn't scare her for some reason, which I thought was strange. It walked up to the foot of her bed, climbed up and sat down with his legs hanging over the edge. My mom didn't do anything, she said she just stared at him. He looked like a gnome according to her description. At least that's what I came up with. He sat there trying to get comfortable, and when he was finally situated, he reached in a little bag he was carrying and pulled out a pipe. He lit it, took a couple puffs, turned and faced her. He said that he had some bad news about my father, but not to worry, he was okay. He continued on that my father was in terrible trouble and that she will hear more about it in the morning. He tapped his pipe in his hand, jumped off the bed and crawled out the window. That's when it finally sank in my mom's head, of what just happened, and she decided to call out for my grandmother. My grandmother came in, turned the light on and asked her what was wrong. As my mom explained, my grandmother, not paying attention to my mother, noticed smoke lingering in the room and asked if she'd been smoking. My mom told her the story again. My grandmother didn't believe her. The next morning, my mother got a phone call from the army and said that my father was injured in an attack and would be home in about 10 days. My grandmother believed her then. I asked my mom why she thought it was a ghost. She said that was because she could see through him. I thought ghosts could float or whatever. Why did this ghost gnome have to crawl through an open window? She didn't know.
Just wanted to let you know that in early July 2018 my wife saw some little people. Now she's never been into anything like this and it scared her. We came in rather late, and after bringing stuff in, I looked up and saw a beautiful view of the Milky Way. We live out in the weeds and there's not much light pollution, so we have a good view of the night sky after I turned off the porch light. After viewing the sky, she looked a little distance across our storm cellar and froze and said, "What is that?" I asked her and she said it looked like two small older men, not exactly walking, kind of gliding. She said they seemed happy and then they noticed she saw them. Their eyes narrowed and they disappeared. She was really frightened, and when I questioned her she was adamant about what she saw. She's never studied fairy mythology and I told her it went along with some of the stuff I've read. I, unfortunately, did not see them. Just wanted to pass this along to you. The next day I pulled up fairy images on the net and she said the closest resemblance to it is a gnome.
I've always been a firm believer in the paranormal and have had my fair share of strange occurrences and encounters. I'm quite curious to know if anyone has had a similar experience to mine. Before I begin, if you're unfamiliar with Redcaps, they're a type of malevolent fey goblin found in English folklore. I was a bit startled to discover this artist's depiction looks disturbingly similar to what I'd seen, except the head was significantly larger than the body in my case. Also, it was not wielding a weapon from memory. This was a very early childhood memory. I can't recall my exact age at the time, but I'd estimate that I was around 5 to 7 years old. Unfortunately, I can only recount a small, specific point in the story, but nonetheless this is what happened. I was in my parents' bedroom, crying in fear, as I witnessed what appeared to be a very short, malicious-looking, fair-skinned goblin, wearing a pointed red cap. It simply stood on the end of the bed, laughing maniacally at me. My mother was trying to calm me down and had no idea why I was so hysterical, since she couldn't see or hear anything. So seemingly, only I was able to see this entity. That's all I can remember, sadly. I have absolutely no recollection of what happened after that and never saw this being again. Does anyone have thoughts or insight on what they believe I may have witnessed?
In the Kingdom of England there is a hillock in the midst of a dense wood. Thither in old days knights and their followers were wont to repair when tired and thirsty after the chase. When one of their numbers called out, "I thirst," there immediately started up a goblin with a cheerful countenance, clad in a crimson robe, and bearing in his outstretched hand a large drinking horn richly ornamented with gold and precious jewels, and full of the most delicious, unknown beverage. The goblin presented the horn to the thirsty knight, who drank and instantly felt refreshed and cool. After the drinker had emptied the horn, the goblin offered a silken napkin to wipe the mouth. Then, without waiting to be thanked, the strange creature vanished as suddenly as he had come. Now once there was a knight of churlish nature, who was hunting alone in those parts. Feeling thirsty and fatigued, he visited the hillock and cried out, "I thirst." Instantly the goblin appeared and presented the horn. When the knight had drained it of its delicious beverage, instead of returning the horn, he thrust it into his bosom and rode hastily away. He boasted far and wide of his deed, and his feudal lord hearing thereof caused him to be bound and cast into prison. Then fearing lest he, too, might become partaker in the theft and ingratitude of the knight, the lord presented the jeweled horn to the King of England, who carefully preserved it among the royal treasures. But never again did the benevolent goblin return to the hillock in the woods.
I've been struggling with what I saw and whether or not to share it. Part of me wants to know if I'm not alone in my experience, and the other part wants to believe it was just in my imagination, and I shouldn't attempt to learn more. On the grand scale of experiences, this probably won't be that interesting to some people, but I'm afraid because of it, and that is what has led me to share. 2 nights ago, I was in my apartment with my 1-year-old son. His dad was working the night shift at 1 a.m., so I don't know the exact time this happened, but I'd say between 2 to 4 in the morning. We have a king-sized bed and our son fell asleep with me, so I let him stay there. At some point, I woke up to the baby rolling around the bed and kicking me. At the time, I didn't know what his problem was, but he was keeping me awake. This lasted for a while, because usually when my son sleeps next to me he doesn't move so much, and I figured he'd eventually be still. He didn't though. He kept moving around half asleep, and I was worried that he'd roll off the bed. It felt like this went on for at least 30 minutes if not longer, and I got frustrated that I was awake, so I decided to move him to his playpen in the living room. I laid him down and then went to the bathroom. From the bathroom I could see the living room. I left the door open. I should also mention that even at night it's not completely dark in our apartment, so you can still see fairly well. As I was on the toilet, I looked over to where the playpen is just for a few seconds, and I saw some kind of creature. It was all black and hunched over like it was hiding behind the playpen, but not very well. The playpen is made with see-through netting anyway, so you can see right through it. This thing had long arms, and my memory says it was slightly muscular on its upper body. What struck me as off about the whole thing was that it had long pointy ears like an elf, but bigger. WTF? I finished and rushed to the living room, and nothing was out there, so I walked into the bedroom with the image of this thing lingering in the front of my head. I tried to discount it or come up with an explanation, but I don't have one. I know it's natural for people to see faces or human shapes, but this thing was not human looking, and I've never seen anything like it. There's no reason my brain would have just made this thing up while I'm trying to go to the bathroom and I'm worried about my son. I ended up grabbing the baby, and he slept with me anyway. I wasn't going to take any chances. The next morning he was sick with a cold, so I'm guessing that's why he was so uncomfortable. But it's been a couple days now and I can't shake off what happened. If I had to give this thing a name, I'd say it resembled a large goblin. It also had a larger than human-sized head. I guess I'm looking for input or some kind of advice. Do I pretend nothing happened? How do I protect my family if this was something paranormal and it comes back? I've had a few unexplained experiences in my lifetime, but never anything like this in my own home. This whole thing has me very worried.
The following account comes from the 26th President Teddy Roosevelt. Frontiersmen are not, as a rule, apt to be very superstitious. They lead lives too hard and practical, and have too little imagination in things spiritual and supernatural. I have heard but a few ghost stories while living on the frontier, and those few were of a perfectly commonplace and conventional type. But I once listened to a goblin story, which rather impressed me. A grizzled, weather-beaten old mountain hunter named Bauman, who, born and had passed all of his life on the frontier, told the story to me. He must have believed what he said, for he could hardly repress a shudder at certain points of the tale, but he was of German ancestry, and in childhood had doubtless been saturated with all kinds of ghost and goblin lore, so that many fearsome superstitions were latent in his mind. Besides, he knew well the stories told by the Indian medicine men in their winter camps of the snow walkers and the specters, spirits, ghosts, and apparitions, the formless evil beings that haunt the forest depths and dog and waylay the lonely wanderer who after nightfall passes through the regions where they lurk. It may be that when overcome by the horror of the fate that befell his friend, and when oppressed by the awful dread of the unknown, he grew to attribute, both at the time and still more in remembrance, weird and elfin traits to what was merely some abnormally wicked and cunning wild beast, but whether this was so or not, no man can say. When the event occurred, Bauman was still a young man, and was trapping with a partner among the mountains dividing the forks of the Salmon from the head of Wisdom River. Not having had much luck, he and his partner determined to go up into a particularly wild and lonely pass through which ran a small stream said to contain many beavers. The pass had an evil reputation because the year before a solitary hunter who had wandered into it was slain, seemingly by a wild beast, the half-eaten remains being afterwards found by some mining prospectors who had passed his camp only the night before. The memory of this event, however, weighed very lightly with the two trappers, who were as adventurous and hardy as others of their kind. They took their two lean mountain ponies to the foot of the pass where they left them in an open beaver meadow, the rocky timber-clad ground being from there onward impracticable for horses. They then struck out on foot through the vast, gloomy forest, and in about 4 hours reached a little open glade where they concluded to camp, as signs of game were plenty. There was still an hour or two of daylight left, and after building a brush lean-to and throwing down and opening their packs, they started upstream. The country was very dense and hard to travel through, as there was much down timber, although here and there the somber woodland was broken by small glades of mountain grass. At dusk they again reached camp. The glade in which it was pitched was not many yards wide, the tall, close-set pines and firs rising round it like a wall. On one side was a little stream, beyond which rose the steep mountain slope, covered with the unbroken growth of evergreen forest. They were surprised to find that during their absence something, apparently a bear, had visited camp, and had rummaged about among their things, scattering the contents of their packs, and in sheer wantonness destroying their lean-to. The footprints of the beast were quite plain, but at first they paid no particular heed to them, busying themselves with rebuilding the lean-to, laying out their beds and stores, and lighting the fire. While Bauman was making ready supper, it being already dark, his companion began to examine the tracks more closely, and soon took a brand from the fire to follow them up, where the intruder had walked along a game trail after leaving the camp. When the brand flickered out, he returned and took another, repeating his inspection of the footprints very closely. Coming back to the fire, he stood by it a minute or two, peering out into the darkness, and suddenly remarked, "Bauman, that bear has been walking on 2 legs." Bauman laughed at this, but his partner insisted that he was right, and upon again examining the tracks with a torch, they certainly did seem to be made by but 2 paws or feet. However, it was too dark to make sure. After discussing whether the footprints could possibly be those of a human being, and coming to the conclusion that they could not be, the 2 men rolled up in their blankets, and went to sleep under the lean-to. At midnight Bauman was awakened by some noise, and sat up in his blankets. As he did so his nostrils were struck by a strong, wild beast odor, and he caught the loom of a great body in the darkness at the mouth of the lean-to. Grasping his rifle, he fired at the vague, threatening shadow, but must have missed, for immediately afterwards he heard the smashing of the underwood as the thing, whatever it was, rushed off into the impenetrable blackness of the forest and the night. After this the 2 men slept but little, sitting up by the rekindled fire, but they heard nothing more. In the morning they started out to look at the few traps they had set the previous evening and put out new ones. By an unspoken agreement they kept together all day and returned to camp towards evening. On nearing it they saw, hardly to their astonishment, that the lean-to had again been torn down. The visitor of the preceding day had returned, and in wanton malice had tossed about their camp kit and bedding, and destroyed the shanty. The ground was marked up by its tracks, and on leaving the camp it had gone along the soft earth by the brook. The footprints were as plain as if on snow, and, after a careful scrutiny of the trail, it certainly did seem as if, whatever the thing was, it had walked off on but 2 legs. The men, thoroughly uneasy, gathered a great heap of dead logs and kept up a roaring fire throughout the night, one or the other sitting on guard most of the time. About midnight the thing came down through the forest opposite, across the brook, and stayed there on the hillside for nearly an hour. They could hear the branches crackle as it moved about, and several times it uttered a harsh, grating, long-drawn moan, a peculiarly sinister sound. Yet it did not venture near the fire. In the morning the 2 trappers, after discussing the strange events of the last 36 hours, decided that they would shoulder their packs and leave the valley that afternoon. They were more ready to do this because in spite of seeing a good deal of game signs they had caught very little fur. However, it was necessary first to go along the line of their traps and gather them, and this they started out to do. All the morning they kept together, picking up trap after trap, each one empty. On first leaving camp they had the disagreeable sensation of being followed. In the dense spruce thickets they occasionally heard a branch snap after they had passed, and now and then there were slight rustling noises among the small pines to one side of them. At noon they were back within a couple of miles of camp. In the high, bright sunlight their fears seemed absurd to the 2 armed men, accustomed as they were, through long years of lonely wandering in the wilderness, to face every kind of danger from man, brute, or element. There were still 3 beaver traps to collect from a little pond in a wide ravine nearby. Bauman volunteered to gather these and bring them in, while his companion went ahead to camp and made ready the packs. On reaching the pond, Bauman found 3 beavers in the traps, one of which had been pulled loose and carried into a beaver house. He took several hours in securing and preparing the beaver, and when he started homewards he marked, with some uneasiness, how low the sun was getting. As he hurried toward camp, under the tall trees, the silence and desolation of the forest weighed on him. His feet made no sound on the pine needles, and the slanting sun rays, striking through among the straight trunks, made a gray twilight in which objects at a distance glimmered indistinctly. There was nothing to break the gloomy stillness which, when there is no breeze, always broods over these somber primeval forests. At last he came to the edge of the little glade where the camp lay and shouted as he approached it, but got no answer. The campfire had gone out, though the thin blue smoke was still curling upwards. Near it lay the packs wrapped and arranged. At first Bauman could see nobody, nor did he receive an answer to his call. Stepping forward he again shouted, and as he did so his eye fell on the body of his friend, stretched beside the trunk of a great fallen spruce. Rushing towards it, the horrified trapper found that the body was still warm, but that the neck was broken, while there were 4 great fang marks in the throat. The footprints of the unknown beast creature, printed deep in the soft soil, told the whole story. The unfortunate man, having finished his packing, had sat down on the spruce log with his face to the fire and his back to the dense woods to wait for his companion. While thus waiting, his monstrous assailant, who must have been lurking in the woods, waiting for a chance to catch one of the adventurers unprepared, came silently up from behind, walking with long noiseless steps and seemingly still on 2 legs. Evidently unheard, it reached the man and broke his neck by wrenching his head back with its forepaws, while it buried its teeth in his throat. It had not eaten the body, but apparently had romped and gamboled around it in uncouth, ferocious glee, occasionally rolling over and over it, and had then fled back into the soundless depths of the woods. Bauman, utterly unnerved and believing that the creature with which he had to deal was something either half-human or half-devil, some great goblin beast, abandoned everything but his rifle and struck off at speed down the path, not halting until he reached the beaver meadows where the hobbled ponies were still grazing. Mounting, he rode onwards through the night until beyond reach of pursuit.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel as more green texts will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.
Remember to check out the Odyssey page in the description for a second archive of the channel's videos.